Sometimes it's not just one thing that leads to tragedy. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the distance he misjudged. Maybe it was the absence of bear spray. Or maybe the bear had already decided long before Richard White ever raised his camera. He came to Denali for stillness, for one perfect photograph, but deep in the backcountry, something was watching him. And in just minutes, the piece he sought turned into a violent blur of teeth, claws, and silence. This is the devastating story of wildlife photographer Richard White and his final moments alone in the wild. Welcome to the Animal Quest channel. If you care about wildlife, survival, and real stories from the edge, make sure to subscribe, like, and share. Now, let's step into Denali. Richard White was 49 years old, a quiet, observant man with a deep love for the outdoors and a camera always strapped across his chest. Based in San Diego, California, he had spent years exploring the vast wilderness of the American West. Always alone, always on foot, always with purpose. He wasn't a thrill seeker. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. For Richard, being out in the wild was a form of meditation. It was where he went to feel small again, to watch, to listen, and to capture fleeting moments of nature most people would never see. Those who knew him described him as meticulous. He planned his trips down to the hour. He studied weather patterns, migration seasons, wildlife behavior. He didn't just photograph animals, he understood them. He believed that if you respected the wild would respect you back. He had hiked and photographed solo in Yellowstone Glacier, the Sierra Nevadas. And in August of 2012, he set his sights on something even more remote, something bigger, wilder, and far more unpredictable: Denali National Park in Alaska. Denali is not a place for casual visitors. It stretches across more than 6 million acres, larger than the state of Massachusetts. Towering mountains, dense forests, wide river valleys, and somewhere out there, roaming free, over 300 grizzly bears. It is a place of breathtaking beauty, but it is also a place where nature makes no promises. And yet Richard came not for adrenaline, but for peace. He carried no gun, no travel companion, no unnecessary gear, just a backpack, a tent, a camera, and a notebook. In his journal, later recovered by rangers, he had written one simple line before setting off into the backcountry: hope to capture something true. But what Richard White didn't know was that something in that vast wilderness was already watching him, and it wouldn't wait for permission to strike. August 19th, 2012. The gravel road into Denali was quiet that morning, dust curling into the air as the park shuttle wound deeper into the Alaskan interior. With his camera bag beside him and a map folded neatly in his lap, Richard White sat in silence, staring out at the vastness he had come so far to enter. He had just completed the mandatory safety briefing at the visitor center, a standard requirement for any solo backcountry permit. Rangers had gone over the essentials: proper food storage, campsite spacing, wildlife precautions. They emphasized one thing above all: keep your distance from bears and always carry bear spray. Richard nodded. He listened. He signed the forms, but he did not bring bear spray. Whether it was forgotten, dismissed, or simply not packed, no one would ever know. But when he stepped off the shuttle near the Toklat River crossing, miles from the nearest outpost, he entered the backcountry with no real means of defense. He was assigned Unit 10, a sprawling, open stretch of wilderness near the Toklat River. Few hikers chose this area. It was remote, exposed, and known for frequent bear sightings. But for Richard, that was part of the draw. He wasn't just looking for scenery, he was looking for presence, that raw, undisturbed energy only true wilderness could offer. With his permit in hand and his backpack cinched tight, he crossed into the bush. No cell phone reception, no radio, no satellite beacon. Just him, a camera, a tent, and miles of empty land in every direction. Over the next several days, he moved deeper into the unit, setting up camp in quiet, elevated spots and journaling as he moved. His notes, later recovered by investigators, showed no fear, no mention of anything unusual, just sketches of ridgelines, bird calls, cloud patterns. But what Richard couldn't see, what he would never know, was that in those same valleys, a large adult male grizzly was roaming, tracking, feeding, moving in the same general region, and with no human interference out there, no roads, no crowds. The rules changed. The bear had no reason to retreat. There were no witnesses, no trail cameras. But based on the position of the tracks, the disturbed brush, and Richard's final campsite, investigators believed the encounter was almost entirely by chance. A deadly crossing of paths that neither man nor beast had planned. And when it came fast. Not with growls or warning signs, not with the slow tension of a stalking predator, but with the full, unrelenting force of a wild animal defending its space or claiming it. Richard was alone, and whatever sounds echoed in that valley, whatever final moments he faced, they were swallowed whole by the silence of Denali. August 24th, 2012, late afternoon. The air hung heavy over the Toklat River, thick with silence and the quiet hum of wind moving through the brush. Richard White had been hiking for hours, alone in Unit 10, far beyond the reaches of the usual trails, when he came to a bend along the gravel bar, a shallow riverbed streaked with sunlight and framed by low willows. That's when he saw it. About 50 yards ahead, just past a rise in the terrain, an adult male grizzly bear stood near the water's edge. Its fur shimmered wet, as though it had recently crossed the river or emerged from a wallow. It was large, well over 500 pounds, and completely unaware of Richard's presence, at least at first. Richard didn't retreat. He didn't call for help. He didn't raise an alarm. Instead, he did what he had come here to do. He lowered his pack, reached slowly for his camera, adjusted the lens, and began to take photographs. Frame after frame, he captured the animal as it moved along the river. Snout down, grazing among the stones and shrubs. The bear didn't charge. It didn't growl. There was no immediate threat. The encounter seemed, for a moment, almost peaceful. 8 minutes passed. The photos recovered from his camera would later confirm it. For 8 minutes, Richard observed the bear. Focused, patient, breathing steadily as he framed the shot. But then something changed. The bear stopped grazing. It lifted its head. The next few photos blurred. The framing became erratic. There was motion, a shift. The angle tilted, as if Richard had suddenly stood up or stepped back, and then nothing. The photograph stopped. The camera would be found later, partially buried in dirt and moss, its final image frozen in time. A close-up, out of focus, a swirl of brown fur, sky, and gravel. What happened in the seconds that followed can only be pieced together from the scene. The bear had closed the distance, whether it was curiosity, a sudden perceived threat, or territorial instinct. No one would ever know for sure. But the grizzly charged, and in that exposed stretch of Denali backcountry, with no barrier, no spray, and no escape, Richard White was overtaken. There were no screams recorded, no final transmission, just the wind, the river, the thud of motion through the brush, and then silence. August 25th, 2012. The morning sun crept slowly over the Alaska range, casting long, golden shadows across the winding Toklat River. At the Denali National Park Visitor Center, a ranger glanced at the permit log. One name had not checked back in. Richard White, solo hiker, Unit 10, overdue by more than a day. At first, no alarms were raised. Delays happen in the backcountry. Batteries die, routes change. But as the hours passed, a chill began to set in. Rangers radioed nearby stations. No one had seen him. No one had heard from him. And most concerning of all, his unit, Toklat 10, had recently logged increased bear activity. By late afternoon, a search team was dispatched by helicopter. They scanned the gravel bars and creek beds from the air, following the narrow trails where human prints sometimes weave with animal tracks. And then, just after 4:30 p.m., about 3 miles from the park road, they spotted something. A backpack, propped upright beside a patch of flattened tundra. Nearby, a pair of hiking boots, abandoned and oddly positioned. And just beyond that, a partially buried human body. Park officials sealed off the area and called in reinforcements. A helicopter circled above while rangers moved carefully on foot, bear rifles in hand. They knew the predator could be close. The signs were fresh, the scent in the air unmistakable. The camera was there, the backpack was there. But Richard was gone, and Denali, vast and still, offered no explanation, only silence. The wind picked up over the Toklat River basin as the search team moved in with caution. This wasn't just a recovery now. It was a kill zone. Blood still marked the ground in dark patches where Richard White had made his last stand. The brush around his body was crushed, pawed, scattered. Drag marks ran through the grass like open wounds. The site was cordoned off quickly. Rangers on foot secured the perimeter, while the aerial team circled low above the valley, scanning for movement. No one spoke above a whisper. The tension was thick, every sound amplified. The hum of the helicopter blades, the sharp calls of ravens overhead, the occasional thud of a ranger's boot on soft ground. They knew the bear was still close. Moments later, eyes from the chopper caught movement near a patch of willows just north of the cache site. About 200 yards away, the grizzly was back. Same building, same markings. It moved slowly, deliberately. Not in fear, not in confusion, but with the calm confidence of a predator that had already fed. It didn't flee when it saw the helicopter. It didn't flinch. It stood, broad and heavy, and stared back at the machine overhead as if to say, "This is mine now." That one moment told them everything they needed to know. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity. This was the bear. Command was given from the ground. A ranger in the helicopter leaned out with a scoped rifle, steadied his breath against the turbulence, and fired. One shot rang out across the valley, then another. The bear collapsed. It didn't roar. It didn't resist. It simply fell where it stood, sinking into the brush it had claimed just hours before. When the team reached the body, the silence returned. But this time, it wasn't the eerie quiet of a predator lying in wait. It was the solemn stillness that comes only after violence has ended. The bear was flown out for necropsy. What they found left no doubt. Inside the animal's stomach were unmistakable remnants. Scraps of Richard's clothing, torn pieces of his backpack, shreds of tent fabric, a lens cap from his camera. There was human tissue, bone fragments. The contents were consistent with someone recently consumed. This wasn't a case of a startled bear reacting in fear. This was predation. Richard hadn't stumbled into a random encounter. He had come face to face with a bear that had made a decision, a calculated, fatal decision. And for the first time in Denali's recorded history, a human life had ended this way. Alone, in the wild, devoured and buried by the very force of nature he had come to document. It was the kind of ending no one wanted to believe possible. But the evidence didn't lie. The photos told the story up until the final seconds. The kill site told what came after, and the grizzly, now lifeless on the tundra floor, carried the proof inside its body. Nothing could be undone. No footage could rewind what happened. The wilderness had spoken, and it had taken back what it never promised to protect. And the valley, once so still and sacred in Richard's eyes, was now something else entirely, a place marked forever by silence and blood. In the days that followed the recovery of Richard White's body, Denali National Park was quiet, but not in the way Richard had once found peaceful. This was a heavier silence, one filled with questions, regret, and the haunting weight of a truth no one wanted to say out loud. What went wrong? That question echoed through ranger stations, newsrooms, and living rooms across the country. How could a man so experienced, so prepared, so respectful of wildlife, end up becoming the first person in Denali's history to die from a bear attack? The answer, as it turned out, wasn't simple. It never is in the wild. The photos recovered from Richard's camera showed no signs of panic. No raised claws, no open mouth. The bear appeared calm, disinterested even. It grazed along the Toklat riverbed near mile 83, oblivious, or perhaps indifferent, to the figure standing nearby with a lens aimed at its flank. But wildlife experts would later say those images can be deceiving. Bears don't always telegraph their intentions. Their behavior can shift in seconds. A neutral posture can become a charge without warning. And the distance was wrong. Park regulations require visitors to stay at least 300 yards from any bear. Richard had stood at just over 50. To a bear in the wild, that's not admiration. That's intrusion. Some speculated that perhaps he misjudged the distance. Others believed he may have slowly closed the gap to get a clearer shot. But the end result was the same. He was far too close, and he was alone. No second voice to call out. No second pair of eyes to spot danger. No one to distract the animal or radio for help. He had no bear spray, no deterrent, and no margin for error. One veteran ranger, reviewing the scene days later, put it bluntly. He said, "It wasn't that Richard made one big mistake. He made several small ones. And in bear country, sometimes that's all it takes." At a press conference in Anchorage, Denali spokesperson Maureen McLaughlin stepped forward with a pale face and steady voice. She looked out at the reporters, the microphones, the flashes, and said the words no one had ever had to say before. "It was the first fatal bear attack in the park's history," she said, "and it reminded all of us just how unforgiving the wild can be." No one knew what had triggered the bear's decision. Some thought it was territorial behavior. Others believed it may have been defensive. Perhaps the bear had simply seen an opportunity, one it rarely encounters. A solitary human unaware. But the truth was buried in the silence of that valley. In the moment the shutter stopped, Richard White was not reckless. He was not careless. He was a man who trusted nature. And in a cruel twist, it was nature that turned on him. And for Denali, a park built on the majesty of wildness, that day became a permanent scar. A place once known for pristine solitude now bore the memory of a man who came for beauty and was taken by the very thing he came to honor. The camera was found beside the riverbank, half buried beneath a collapsed cluster of willows near the Toklat River. Its lens was cracked, the strap torn. Yet when rangers powered it on, they discovered that the memory card had survived. The photos were still there. And in those final images, Richard White left behind a silent account of his last hour alive. The first few frames showed the untouched valley, broad expanses of river gravel, distant ridgelines, sunlight filtering through cottonwoods. Then the bear grazing calmly in the open. Slow movements, no raised head, no signs of aggression, and then a shift. The camera angle changed. The composition grew rushed, off balance. The final image was blurry, indistinct, a smear of fur, gravel, and sky. The shutter had captured the instant before everything fell apart. Those photographs became more than evidence. They became testimony. They told the story that Richard never got the chance to finish. When his family was notified in San Diego, they were devastated. His daughter, just 19 at the time, said she had always feared something like this might happen. Not because her father was reckless, but because he believed so deeply that the world was good. He believed that if he showed the wilderness the respect it deserved, it would return that respect. That somehow there was an unspoken trust between man and beast. But the wilderness doesn't make promises. At a memorial held weeks later in Anchorage, several rangers who helped recover his body stood in silence as his photographs were displayed on a screen behind them. Not of bears, but of clouds. 3 trunks, moss on stone, a red fox pausing in early morning light. They said he saw things differently. He wasn't chasing danger or spectacle. He was chasing stillness. Messages poured in from photographers across the country. Some had never met him. Others had shared trails with him in Yosemite, in Glacier, in Sequoia. They called him quiet, thoughtful, intentional. They called him brave. But even among the praise, one phrase echoed louder than the rest. He died doing what he loved. His family repeated it during interviews. Friends posted it on tribute pages. Journalists used it in headlines. But behind those words sat another truth, more painful and less poetic. He died because he was alone, because he got too close, because he didn't carry bear spray, and because sometimes even love for the wild isn't enough to keep it from turning on you. Denali officials later used Richard's story in new safety briefings for backcountry hikers. His photographs, the ones taken just before the attack, were shown as cautionary lessons. A reminder that grizzlies are not props. They are not stories waiting to be told. They are apex predators. A quote from one of the senior rangers who flew the recovery mission was added to the park's incident report. He said, "Richard's photos were beautiful, but no image is worth a life." And as the years passed, hikers still came. Photographers still wandered off the trails. But the name Richard White remained in the ranger logs, a ghost written in the margins of a place that doesn't forget. He came to Denali seeking stillness, but in the end, he became part of its silence. He came for peace, but something was waiting. In the stillness of Denali, Richard White sought connection, not conquest. He came with no threat, no fear, no weapon, only a lens and a hope to witness something real. But the wild does not bend to intention. It does not care for experience or passion or poetry. In the wild, presence is permission, distance is safety, and every decision matters. Richard's camera captured more than beauty. It captured proximity, misjudgment, and a silent predator that didn't need to roar. For anyone who walks into wilderness, whether to hike, to film, to observe, this story is not just a tragedy, it's a reminder. Always carry bear spray, know your surroundings, never underestimate nature, and never assume that the silence means safety. In Denali, silence speaks volumes, but Richard White's camera speaks louder than ever. If you found this story important, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more real-life wildlife encounter documentaries. Thank you for watching and see you in our next video.